Okay, thank you all for coming. I think I know most of you. For those who don't know me, I'm Edward Miller. I'm an associate professor in the history department here. And I'd like to welcome you to this panel discussion that we're having this evening with three Dartmouth alums who are also veterans of the Vietnam War. The way the format's going to work, I'm going to very briefly introduce all three of our panelists, and then each of them will take just a few minutes. All of you have read the essays that they've written about their experiences in Vietnam. So they're each going to take just a few minutes to sort of amplify and contextualize what they've written in those essays. And then we're going to open up the floor for question and answer and hopefully be able to devote most of the time to that. Okay, so starting on my right, on your left, we have Francis Bud Mcgrath, who is originally from Massachusetts, I understand, Wakefield?
Yes.
But he now lives in Maine, where he is an honest-to-God professor of English at the University of Southern Maine. Next to Bud is Jim Laughlin. Jim has made a career as a lawyer. He's retired now and lives in Florida. And last but not least, we have Lee Chilcote, who is a native of Cleveland, Ohio, and still lives in Cleveland, I understand. So with those brief introductions, let me turn it over. We didn't actually talk about an order, but is it all right if we just go in the order that I introduced you? All right, so we'll turn things over to Bud, first of all.
Okay. Well, can you hear me okay? Is that all right? All right. Ed asked me to talk about myself. I don't usually like to talk about myself, actually. So I'll fill you in with a few details about my experience at Dartmouth. I was in ROTC here, along with, in the Army ROTC, along with Jim. Jim and I sort of met there. I was an English major here. When we left ROTC, I took a regular Army commission, went into the military immediately after graduation. I spent 2 years in Germany and a year at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, which was originally built to hunt down Cochise. And they still had some barracks that were empty, and they used them to train troops to go to Vietnam. And in the classic military logic, they had me training troops to go there before I had been there myself. After I spent a year in Arizona, I went to Vietnam, and I spent a year there. I was in the Artillery, and I was stationed at Bearcat, which is about 15 miles northeast of what used to be called Saigon. When I left the military after my year in Vietnam, I went to graduate school immediately. In fact, the military was very considerate, and they let me out a month early so that I didn't have to start graduate school late. And I actually got involved in some anti-war activities during my graduate school. I went to the University of Texas at Austin. And after that, I became an English professor. I taught at the University of Pennsylvania, Rutgers University, and University of Southern Maine. And that's basically my background, and I have some things I could say about the war, but I think I will wait and let Jim and Lee introduce themselves.
Great, thanks. Jim?
Hi, I'm Jim Laughlin, and I know you've all read my essay. Professor Miller has asked me to tell you a little bit about my background. I guess I'm your classic Dartmouth success story. I was born and raised in a blue-collar working-class town called Kearney, New Jersey, which is in Hudson County, bordered on the east by the Meadowlands and on the south and west by the beautiful Passaic River and the city of Newark. The same people I started kindergarten with, I graduated from high school with because nobody moved in and nobody moved out. And if you ever got in trouble, your parents would know about it before you got home. So that's kind of my original upbringing. I managed to get into Dartmouth because of my grades, and I was a history major here and went through the ROTC program, as Bud has told you. I'm not going to regurgitate what I put in my essay, but I did want to touch on one subject that's affected me recently, which is the widespread use of the chemical defoliant known as Agent Orange in Vietnam. We had our own little weapon of mass destruction and didn't even know about it. And it's come back to haunt us, me in particular, and the Vietnamese people in particular, 40-some years after the war. The Department of Veterans Affairs has published a list of conditions that are presumptively caused by exposure to Agent Orange, and they're about as nasty as you can get, including the one that I have, which is Parkinson's disease. I don't know if you all know it, but the volume of Agent Orange that was used in Vietnam is truly astounding. The chemical was manufactured by the Monsanto and Dow Chemical Corporations. And over the course of the period from 1962 through 1971 in what was called Operation Ranch Hand, 20 million gallons of this chemical was sprayed at concentrations estimated at 13 times the USDA recommendations for weed control. Approximately 12% of the total area of South Vietnam was sprayed by 1971. The goal was to deprive the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese regulars of the cover of vegetation, force the urbanization of the population to deprive the guerrillas of their rural support base and food supply. And all in all, a total of 25 million acres of agricultural land was destroyed, plus 20% of the forested area of South Vietnam. About 38 of the former major U.S. bases, including Bien Hoa, Phu Cat, and Da Nang, are affected by contamination. At Da Nang, the concentrations are up to 350 times the recommended remediation levels. And in 2005, finally, the U.S. EPA began working with the Vietnam government on the Da Nang problem. This was accelerated in 2006 when President George W. Bush made a state visit to Vietnam and agreed with the president, who was then I believe was President Triet, that the U.S. would cooperate with them in a joint effort to clean up the contaminated sites in order to foster better relations between the two countries. So in June of 2011, a U.S.-funded cleanup was commenced at Da Nang. 2012 additional funds were committed, and it still remains to be seen how this is all going to work itself out. But the interesting thing is, if any of you have seen the ads that the tour companies are running for tours to Vietnam, one of the major attractions they always project is the city of Da Nang and what's known as China Beach. Da Nang is one of the most contaminated sites in the entire country of Vietnam, as well as the Cu Chi areas where they had you crawling through the tunnels if you want to go do that. It's a terrible problem, and it's 40-some years in the making, and I don't know how many years it's going to take to clean it up. And with that, I'll let my friend Lee here pick up on his story.
We're just doing the introductions
Yes.
first, okay. Good evening, all of you. Can I ask one question? Are there any veterans in the audience? Okay, good. Just about my background, as many people in our class had done, I came from an independent private school in Cleveland, Ohio, to Dartmouth. In those days, Dartmouth freshman classes were predominated by boarding schools and independent day schools. That's all changed, but that's the way it was. And as Professor Miller already said, I was born and lived in Cleveland, and I've lived in Cleveland my whole life. I had a father who was Dartmouth class of 30, a brother class of 57, an uncle class of 45. I obviously graduated with the class in 1964, there 65. I went to Tuck but did not graduate because I took my commission in the United States Marine Corps. I was a reservist in Navy ROTC for my first 2 years and a Marine Corps reservist my last 2 years. And in between there, I was appointed by the Secretary of Navy to become a regular officer, but I declined. While at Dartmouth, I was was pretty active in Dartmouth Outing Club, Ledyard Canoe Club. I played 4 years of soccer here for a dear coach, Whitey Burnham, who's died a few years ago. And I did intramural wrestling. By virtue of handling court-martials in the military, in the Marine Corps as a captain, during my last few months, I became interested in law. I went to law school, University of California, Hastings, and been a lawyer for 40 years. But one of the things that I learned in the Marine Corps, and I'll stop with this, is that the service that we gave permeated me so that what I wanted to do is be a lot more than a lawyer. I just wanted to be someone who gave back to their community. So I have involved myself in nonprofit activity, which is a whole nother book, for the past 40 years. And I, without exaggerating, I would say I've spent close to 25% of my time. You make less money, you're not as prominent, but you feel better about what you do. So that's my personal background.
Great. Thanks very much. Let me just respond to what Bud said about how he doesn't like to talk about himself. We're all very grateful that you've come here to talk about yourselves and to talk about your experiences tonight. I know from conversations that I've had with other veterans over the years, many people are not comfortable talking about their experiences in war in general or in Vietnam in particular. So we're all particularly appreciative that you all are here. Let's go ahead and open it up for questions, because you all have questions, right? Yes. So, is there someone who would like to lead off for us? Francis.
Hi. I'm Francis, and the most recent event we've been learning about in just our class has been the Tet Offensive. And we talk a lot about how it became a major turning point in the war. It's just especially in America and among American citizens and how they view the war. But I was wondering, maybe looking at it from your point of view, I know Mr. McGrath and Mr. Laughlin, you guys talked about it a little bit in your essays, but maybe how that impacted you as soldiers fighting in Vietnam, how you guys viewed it.
Steve, let me ask, do you need us to repeat the question? Or?
I think that would be helpful if you could do that.
It's helpful, but...
Okay. Well, I'll do it. The question was about the Tet Offensive, and specifically about the impact that it had on you. I think both Bud and Jim were in Vietnam when the Tet Offensive took place, but more generally, what was your perception of the importance of the offensive both in Vietnam and in the United States?
My sense from Tet probably coalesces with my sense of my entire tour over there, was that we weren't really accomplishing much. And we had this enormous military firepower, all these personnel over there, and yet there was never any sense of progress. And I think that that Tet somewhat confirmed that, not only for us on the ground there, but also I think for people back home here. And I think that was one reason that it was a turning point. Actually, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese forces who were in the South after Tet were actually pretty much brutalized even more after Tet, but the psychological impact that Tet had, I think, was substantial, both over there and back here.
I would agree with Bud. I think the Tet Offensive marked a turning point in the war. I believe it was a disaster for the VC and the NVA in terms of its military effectiveness because of the overwhelming firepower that we were able to bring to bear on them. Once we got over the initial shock of being hit, we pretty much cleaned up the opposition. but I believe it had a serious negative mental impact on the troops in Vietnam and on the civilian populace back here in the United States. Because I think it finally brought out to the forefront the fact that we essentially were opposing a war of national liberation, and these guys weren't going to quit until they succeeded. And as Bud said, there was a sense of futility. We never seemed to make any progress doing anything, no matter what we did.
I would just add a comment. I was not in Vietnam in '68. I came back in '67, but there were two Tet Offensives, '66 and '67. The way I view what was going on there is that the North Vietnamese regulars and the Viet Cong in the South were beginning to get their act together, and the '66 and '67 Tet Offensives, they were trying to find out how to psychologically damage us. They were pretty rough Tet Offensives. The one that gets cited is always '68 because it was by far and away the worst. Actually, in a perverse way, it was the Marine Corps' shining hour. The Marine Corps performed better in the Tet Offensive than any time for the rest of the Vietnam War. And they were very successful, but as these two have indicated, it's the psychological impact that won the day.
If I just might add one thing to that, if anyone is really interested, I brought a book that I'm going to leave with Professor Miller on a loan basis, specifically devoted to the Tet Offensive, and it's an excellent text if you want to take a look at it. Look at the photographs and the maps. You'll see in great detail exactly what happened in that fateful time period.
Another question? Ryan?
Just going off of Ted we were talking about, do you think it was accurately represented by the media? That's certainly a lot of time spent discussing that in our class or in text. It seems to be an issue that the media may misrepresented it. Just interested in hearing your perspective.
So the question is, do you think that the Tet Offensive was accurately represented by the American media? And I think, Ryan, you're referring specifically to the allegation that the media portrayed it as a defeat for the U.S. in South Vietnam when, in fact, it was a military victory.
Right.
So what do you think of that claim that some scholars and journalists have advanced?
Well, when we were there, our only access to the media was Stars and Stripes.
And they didn't portray it as a defeat.
They did not portray it as a defeat, no. And in fact, all the feedback that we got, through military channels was that, we were doing our job there and that things were progressing rather nicely. But you could see that just from what was happening on the ground that there wasn't any progress there. I think the portrayal of Tet as a defeat is that it had the psychological impact that the North Vietnamese government and the Viet Cong wanted. It was not a military success. In fact, it was, as Jim pointed out, it was devastating to the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese because of the retaliation that resulted from it. But it was, I think it did bring home the fact, as Jim pointed out, that they weren't going to quit. The fact that they could mount such a broad-based offensive at that point in the war, I think had a significant psychological effect on everybody.
I would have no way of knowing what was reported in the States while I was in Vietnam. I think it was when I got home that I realized that the public opinion had turned violently against the war and against those of us who were involved in the war, which was a very hard thing to deal with.
I guess the only thing I can add is I think accurately was portrayed as the turning point. And, by this point, I was in law school in California, and the next year we had bombing of Cambodia and shut down the University of California for 2 months. And so at that point, it was pretty clear that the United States was going to pick a different path here.
Jake?
I guess I have a broader question. Mr. Chilcote, you talked about in your essay sort of about how when you first were in OCS, how you weren't quite prepared for it. And I guess when you all joined the service, you were our age or not much older. And what were sort of the lessons that the most important lessons that you took away in terms of leadership, especially being that you were similar ages to us?
What was your question?
So the question was, when you joined the military, what were the most important lessons as far as leadership that you gained as a result of that experience? Get that right?
Well, I think that I probably learned more in the military than I ever learned in school. It's an experience where a great amount of responsibility is thrust upon you as an officer. You're responsible for leading men and managing equipment. In my own personal experience, the second week I was in the Mekong Delta attached to the G2 Air Section, which was the aerial reconnaissance section, my commanding officer was killed, and I was the next officer in line, and the motto is step up or step aside, Lieutenant. So the next thing I knew, I was running a multi-billion-dollar-a-year aerial reconnaissance operation at the age of 26 with very little prior experience. And you just do the job.
I guess the response I would give is a very personal one. This caused me to gain a maturity that I didn't even know I had inside me. My first week in Vietnam, I was thrown into combat as a platoon leader. I was 23 at the time. And before I was 25, I commanded a company in a combat situation. It's life-changing, and the leadership skills that you gain is a sense of loyalty, a bond with people that you know that you'll do anything to protect their survival. And I guess that's a life skill. It's a life skill that carries you into everything else you do the rest of your life, whether it's professional. And I certainly didn't learn that at Dartmouth, and I learned it in the Marine Corps.
I would say one of the most important things that I had learned there about leadership is how important it is to have good people working for you. And that's something that has stayed with me the rest of my life. I've had some very good NCOs and subordinate officers working for me, and that was extremely important in terms of getting the job done, especially in Vietnam. And it requires a lot of teamwork, and I made some mistakes my first couple of years, but I had been in the military for 3 years before I went to Vietnam, and I'm glad I made those mistakes before I went. They were mainly mistakes in, sort of dealing with people. In the military, you learn pretty quick.
Another question? Mark, and then Rebecca.
Have you noticed regarding the perception of the war and veterans in particular? I know you were saying that, during the war, obviously there were protests and kind of people didn't quite understand that you guys shared similar thoughts. But have you noticed any kind of progression since then, or is it still kind of peak? Do you think, society has kind of learned a lesson in a way?
So the question is about American public responses to veterans and what those were like at the time, and then how those have changed in the years since the end of the war.
Lee, you want to?
Yeah, I'll tell you a story, and I don't mean to be too graphic about this, but I came into Coronado, California in March of 1967. I had no idea that the perception of the war, that the perception of support for the war had changed 100% to perception of against the war, but it had. And the day I came in to the United States, a Marine was shot coming off a plane in Chicago by a protester. So that's one end of the spectrum. What has amazed me, and I've not been one to participate one way or the other in the past 45 years, but what has amazed me is I went to what was called Marine Week here just in June of this year, and the support for the military in general has changed. I mean, there were 100,000 people that came out for that week, and whereas 45 years ago, nobody talked, if they knew I was a military veteran, they didn't talk at all to me, and I didn't, that didn't bother me a bit. I didn't particularly want to talk about protests or the war or anything else. But 45 years later, people are interested in the history of Vietnam, the policies that evolved, exactly the kind of course that you're taking is fascinating to people, and I've had a lot of conversations in the last few years, whether it's due to support for the military in the present conflicts or whether it's due to just time. I'm not quite clear. I'm not clairvoyant enough to know what the reasons are, but there's a fair amount of support for Vietnam veterans today, whereas there was none when I came back. So I hope that helps.
Jim, you alluded, I think, to this issue in
Yeah, I think
earlier comments.
I think they're both correct. When we came back, I don't know why it was, but when we came back from Vietnam, the general public seemed unable to divorce the fact that we were the warriors and not the policymakers who were responsible for our involvement in that country. I think the situation as it now exists with the Iraq and Afghanistan veterans is completely different, that these men are treated with respect for the sacrifices they've made, and I've noticed recently that people are more complimentary toward me and toward other Vietnam vets for what we did when we did it.
Do any of you have sort of particular experiences that you remember from the time? I mean, Lee, you mentioned the Marine in Chicago who was shot. That must have had a powerful impact. Were there any other episodes that you recall that happened to you or to others that you heard about?
Well, I can remember how there were a lot of traumatized veterans, and in my very early years, I tried to go to some VA hospitals thinking that I could help in some way. What I noticed during that time is that there was just, other than the Veterans Administration itself, there was no public support for even for amputees or people who were traumatized. And obviously there were counselors and others out there that could have helped, but there was no help at all. That has all changed. I know a pastor who about 1980 began a career and spent his whole life supporting Vietnam veterans and other veterans who had been injured. So I don't know, that's another thought. That's how it's changed.
I had a similar experience to what Lee did when I walked, as I said, I went right from Vietnam to graduate school, and I was surprised. Nobody was interested in talking to me about the war or ask me anything about it. They just wanted to sort of ignore the fact, and so did I, so it wasn't really a problem for me. But, you know, looking back on it, it was rather unusual. I think I was probably the only veteran in the graduate program. But there was a total lack of interest in it.
You mentioned you were involved in some anti-war activities.
Yes.
And even in that context with people who were against the war, there was just no interest in hearing about your experiences or learning about the war.
No.
So they were against the war but didn't want to actually learn about it.
That's one reason I didn't join their organizations, is that they were fairly naive about, I mean, even though I sympathized with them because I saw firsthand what the war was doing and what it was not doing, and I, you know, they were, you know, ideologically opposed to it, but they didn't have much of a firm grounding about what they were even objecting to. And so, I don't know, they didn't want to talk about it, really. And it was, I guess, I got interested in the anti-war when it looked like the war was going to expand rather than contract, when Nixon started bombing Cambodia.
All right.
Was sort of the turning point for me.
Right. This is an episode we haven't talked about yet. We get to Nixon next week, but we will get there soon enough. Rebecca, I believe you had a question.
My question was also about the anti-war movements when you guys returned from your service. Mr. Laughlin, you sort of alluded to this in your essay when you were at Princeton, and you talked about some anti-war riots and your affiliation with them, and I was wondering if you were willing to elaborate on what happened, and also, for all of you guys, what your experience was like returning home, and sort of where you aligned with the protests that were going on, and how you reacted to that as a veteran.
So the question is about the anti-war movement and the panelists' experience or encounters with the anti-war movement, and specifically, Jim, you in your essay referred to something that happened at Princeton after you returned.
Yes. My first civilian job was as assistant legal counsel to Princeton University. I was hired by a guy named Larry Caruso, who I thought was a great fellow and a very bright attorney. And a couple of the reasons why he hired me was, number one, I had already been admitted to the New Jersey bar, and number two, I wasn't going to get picked off by the draft because I'd already been in the Army. So about the second year I was there, in early 1971, the anti-war protests had reached a fever pitch, and there were some riots on the Princeton University campus, and some of the demonstrators firebombed the Institute for Defense Analysis in von Neumann Hall by throwing a Molotov cocktail down the ventilation shaft. And then they tried to firebomb Nassau Hall, which is one of the oldest buildings in the country and was, for a period of time during the Revolution, the seat of the Continental Congress. The president of the university was a fellow named Bob Goheen, and he convened a joint faculty staff meeting after that incident, and we were all sitting in the main assembly room, and you could smell the smoke from the attempted bombing. And he was going on and on about how the war was so terrible, and we had to allow these students the rights to express themselves and exercise their freedom of speech and freedom of protest. And in the middle of his talk, my boss put up his hand and said, "Excuse me, Mr. President, I'm an attorney, and I'm in favor of civil rights and freedom of expression as much as anyone. But that doesn't mean that these students can go running around this campus, throwing firebombs at buildings and yelling, 'Burn, baby, burn.'" Well, there was a dead silence in the room, and Goheen continued and concluded his talk, and we left the building, and we were walking back to our office, and Larry said to me, "I'm sorry I did that, Jim." And I said, "Why, Larry? I thought what you said was right on point." He said, "I'm afraid I cost us our jobs." I said, "Larry, that can't be. This is Princeton University, the bastion of freedom of speech and freedom of expression." Well, a few weeks later, he got called up to the office of Ricardo Mestris, who worked for President Goheen, and he got fired. And then I got called and I got fired, and we crossed paths. He was coming down back to our office and I was going up, and he said to me, "I did the best I could for you. I got you 2 months severance pay." And that was what happened in terms of our treatment as being opposed to this violent bombing on the campus. I was ready to move on anyway.
I think part of the question, if I recall it, was that you wanted to know what our reactions were during the protest time. Is that right? Did I get that right? Well, I can tell you what I did, and right or wrong. Marines are a funny bunch. They stick together. So I didn't pay any attention to the protests at all. for all of the years that they occurred. I didn't watch, listen, or do anything else. What I did do is go talk to Marines, whether it's the Marine Corps birthday or some other time, and I met Marines in Cleveland, which gave me some solace. It was very difficult for people like me because we thought we had gone there and we had done really a pretty good job. We didn't know how to nation build. We didn't know how to, you know, support South Vietnam in a non-military way. So we were doing what we were told to do because, in fact, my view is the United States didn't know how to go into another country and do this kind of thing at all. It had no idea. We had never fought in a guerrilla war. We had never participated. The officers, such as myself, who were trained, as I said in my article, on tactics that had been used by Che Guevara, who was a born Marxist. That's what we were. We had a manual. I still have the thing about guerrilla warfare, and it cites Che Guevara in it. And so we had a lot of pride about what we did. We didn't have much confidence in folks like McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense at the time. And you know, going back to the media question, I think the media just pounced on the situation because of the ineptness of the leadership in this country at the time, and it fed into this to a degree. Particularly, I think the Johnson administration was entirely different than the Kennedy administration would have been had Kennedy lived. It would have been a much different, maybe the same outcome, but it would have been much differently handled.
That is a question that we have taken up in class. Bud, do you have anything you wanted to add about the question of the anti-war movement?
I can tell you a few details about the march that protested the bombing of Cambodia in Austin when I was there. There was a question about whether the judge was going to allow the march to go or whether they were going to get an injunction against the march. And things were so heated down there that some of the cowboys from the outlying areas came in and actually positioned themselves up on buildings with rifles. And if the march had not been approved, they were going to help the police to sort things out and put these hippies in line. And fortunately, the judge had some sense, and he allowed the march to go forward. And I mean, the worst that we got was tear gassed, which I had experienced before, so it wasn't especially new to me. But it was kind of ironic to come back to this country and have to face people with rifles again and be tear gassed for expressing my opinion about a war I had fought, but also wound up opposing in the end. It's just sort of one of the ironies of that experience.
Another question? Grace.
I know you were already in Vietnam in different periods, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your initial attitude going in, and whether your attitude and perception of the war changed over time.
What was the question?
The question was, how did your perception of an attitude toward the war change over the time you were in Vietnam?
Well, maybe, if it's okay, I'll go first here. I think in my case, I was pretty naive. I was very patriotic. I had bought everything that had been taught to me in NROTC and in Marine Corps training. What you learn, of course, is that all wars are really terrible, and there's little value in war itself, and I think when you come out of these experiences, you realize how senseless they are. So, but so you go through this experience, and you become a little jaundiced. I had a recent experience with a born Russian who was conscripted in World War II. He's 97 years old. I heard him speak about a month ago. And he was conscripted into the German army to fight against the United States. And he was captured at Normandy and ultimately worked for the State Department during the time of the Marshall Plan and the German Reconstruction. And he wrote a diary about his experience. And what you realize out of that is that if you had the knowledge you have after you've done the experience, you would never do it. But we were all loyal. In 1965, this country was very supportive of the Vietnam effort. We were a little worried about the Johnson administration and its ability to handle things, but we had no doubt that we had the right cause. And obviously, you look at it from afar, you realize that we had no ability to manage that war, do that war. And in some ways, things haven't changed. We're doing it over again. So that's my comment.
Yeah, I don't think my attitude changed so much as it evolved after I arrived in Vietnam. Because as was stated earlier, we really knew very little about what was going on over there. And it wasn't until I went on active duty in July of 1967 that I suddenly realized that this was a major effort. And the third week I was in infantry training, a bunch of us were called in and told that our orders were canceled. And since we were all lawyers, we were all headed to Vietnam without much further training because they knew we weren't going to stay in the service. And I see the same problem in the Afghanistan effort. We were floundering around, we were having green on blue shootings. It's a terrible situation.
I had a similar experience to Lee. I had no idea what to expect when I arrived in Vietnam. You have this, in terms of, when you're in a combat zone, the worst times are your first week there and your last week there. That's when you experience fear the most. The last week, you don't want to go anywhere. If you could stay in your bunker or your foxhole, that's what you'd like to do. But in between, you just shut it out. You know, you have to in order to be able to function. And I was very naive when I went over there. I had no idea what to expect. But by the time I left, you know, I had certainly lost confidence in decisions that were made politically to send troops there in the first place. And there was not much about the war that made a whole lot of sense to me.
And just to add one point, in defense of the folks who were going to Afghanistan and went to Iraq, one thing not to comment further on war, but the qualifications and the training and the coordination of our military forces is so vastly improved and so good. It is what I think it does is it tempts the leaders of our nation to think that they can do anything in anybody else's country. But they are very good. I've met a lot of Afghan and Iraq veterans, and they have training that we never even thought about having.
For example?
Well, for example, I was thrown in a situation where I had to train troops how to fight guerrilla warfare. I had a 10-page manual, which I still have, that was lessons, entitled Lessons from Che Guevara. And it's how Che Guevara went into South America and trained guerrillas to fight guerrilla warfare. Well, it had nothing to do with Vietnam, and we were on our own. And when I say train, I'm talking about training in the field in Vietnam. We didn't have any training in the United States. This was all, it was done in Da Nang for a week before I went out and actually ran the troops. And today, your Marines, your Army, your Navy are highly trained. And, you know, Nathaniel Fick, who was what class was he, 98?
99.
99, has written that wonderful book, One Bullet Away. And if you read that, you'll see just how good folks are. And it's a great book.
Hey, do you all know who Nathaniel Fick is?
He's on the trust. He's on the board of trustees.
Yeah, he's an alumni, Dartmouth class of '99, and an Iraq War veteran. And well, anyway, any other comments on this? Another question? Yes, Jackson.
I was wondering about, basically at your time of graduation, how the general Dartmouth student body perceived members of the ROTC, and do you think that this, specifically at Dartmouth, it would, I guess the general student body's attitude towards ROTC members would be more or less the same throughout the country?
There certainly wasn't any, I mean, nobody knew much about Vietnam when we were here. It was, the only people who were in Vietnam were people who volunteered to go there as advisors. And the Kennedy administration wanted to keep it fairly quiet. And so not many people knew what was going on. Lee had a military history instructor here who knew more than others. Our ROTC instructors for the Army, I don't think they ever talked about Vietnam, did they?
Not that I can recall.
Yeah, I can't recall it either. And so, I mean, there was no particular attitude toward ROTC. It was just, you know, sort of another activity that you could be involved with here. And one of the big differences between then and now is you had the draft to deal with, which encouraged more people into ROTC than probably would have otherwise. You know, I mean, that's one of the reasons that I joined ROTC. I figured if I'm going to have to serve in the military, I'd rather do it as an officer than as an enlisted man, you know, working for some officer who didn't know what they were doing. I'd rather be the officer that didn't know what he was doing.
You know, the college was pretty supportive. I'm guessing, but I guess that there were 150 of our class of 600 that were in some form of ROTC at the time, and it was supported by the public. It was supported by the colleges. I don't think there was any difference of opinion. There certainly wasn't. And the way I think about that is that throughout that whole period, around the world, the United States was viewed as heroic because of World War II and so forth. That was carrying all the way up to the 60s. So you went anywhere in the world and there was respect for U.S. military. So naturally, at least at that point, there was at home. And until the public learned what policies were being carried out in Vietnam, what the thinking was, they didn't, the difference, as someone has said, is that somehow the military got tied up with the protests to the degree that there was no ability to distinguish what any particular military unit or service had done in service for the country. Today, what is obviously happening is there's support for the military, but not necessarily support for the war. And that's my thought.
Jim, do you want? No, I don't think I have anything else to say.
Another question? Bridget.
Mr. McGrath, you mentioned that you had a loss of confidence in policymakers by the time that you returned from the war. And I was wondering, just from everyone with your 20/20 hindsight, who would you blame for the like if you could blame one policymaker, who would you blame for the mistakes of Vietnam?
Oh, wow.
It's a generalized question, sorry.
There are a lot of people
Just
we could
one.
blame.
Just one policymaker to blame.
One, you only get one?
I don't know. I don't think I could point the finger at it. I mean, one of the ways that my specialty in teaching is Irish literature and culture. The Irish were colonized for over 700 years by the British, and I approach Irish literature from sort of a post-colonial perspective. And I see Vietnam now also in that perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And and it's not, I mean, to point a finger at someone, even for just Vietnam, because I mean, we have since World War II, we have a long history. I mean, there's Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, where we have tried to solve problems militarily and haven't been able to solve them. We still haven't learned that to intervene in a civil war doesn't usually have a good outcome. And to think, for instance, as they did when going into Iraq, that they were going to be in and out in, 6 weeks, or was it 6 months? I can't remember. But, when you put yourself in the middle of a civil war, there is no good outcome for the foreign intervener. Maybe with, it looks like maybe perhaps with Syria and Libya, we've learned that there's another way to accomplish something. And I honestly think that, for instance, I think the Arab Spring has accomplished more in the Middle East and in North Africa than our military ever could. Okay, and it's just the whole notion that we can solve these problem areas, and most of them are neo-colonial problems of one kind or another, with the military, just doesn't work. And if you look at Afghanistan, the British have tried there, the Russians have tried there, and now we're involved in a 10-year plus war with, again, like as in Vietnam, we're supporting a relatively corrupt, weak regime. I mean, when are we going to learn? I mean, there is no single person that I could point the finger at, but there's something wrong with our system and our whole way of thinking about how we solve these global problems.
Yeah, I think we could point the finger at Johnson and Kissinger and McNamara. We can point the finger at William Westmoreland and the military high command at the worst points of the war. But the problem, as I see it, is once we started to get involved in the place, we got sucked into a whirlpool, and our leaders couldn't figure out how to get us out. They just couldn't deal with it.
I have a little different view, and you all have studied this, so you probably know more about it than I do, but I've kind of lived it. I know that, going back to Eisenhower, that in essence the United States had wanted to posture itself to stop the spread of communism in Asia. And by the time this got to Kennedy, it was an inherited situation. There was I guess today you'd call them neocons, but then you could find a whole Pentagon of people who were ready to go into Vietnam. As you move forward into the Johnson, I believe that McNamara was a disaster as a defense secretary, but that doesn't mean he gets blamed for this, because look what happened. when I went there, it was fairly obvious there was no Vietnamese government to support. I mean, we're troops on the ground. We're not policymakers. We don't know anything, but we knew that much. And you go to the villages and you find out that the village chief had been killed 10 years earlier and nobody had replaced it. The French were thrown out. And I think, as Bud has said, it probably is 100 years of colonialism that had more to do with it than anything else. So I don't know that you can, our mistake was, with all the knowledge that the United States had by 1965, how did someone make the choice that this was winnable? I've never been able to find anybody that can answer that.
Well, that's another question that we have talked about in the class, and it's one that it's probably the single most debated question in Vietnam War historiography, are those decisions that Johnson and the men around him make in 1965.
I'd go farther and say we didn't even know what winning meant, but then I'd be.
Another question? Ben.
Thank you all for coming and speaking with us today. We've read a lot in our classes about kind of the day-to-day horrors of being a soldier in Vietnam. And we've also talked a little bit tonight about kind of coming back from the war to an unappreciated public and the difficulties of that. And I was just wondering if the three of you, having lived those experiences, could maybe talk about the most difficult aspect of the war personally, and what was hardest for you?
So the question is, there are many difficult things about serving in Vietnam, both service on the battlefield and then returning home to an unappreciative public. And you're asking the panelists, what is the most difficult aspect of their Vietnam experience?
What the most difficult single day was, or in general?
Sure.
Well, my most single difficult day was the day my commanding officer got killed and I had to step in and take over the aerial reconnaissance section for the entire 4th Corps of the country. And I remember, do all of you know what a dust-off was? The dust-off is a medevac helicopter, usually a Huey with 2 door gunners to protect the pilot and the co-pilot. I was at the airfield when the dust-off came in and brought his body in, and for some reason the pilot was reluctant to set down on the hard stand, and he was hovering a foot or so above the ground level. When the corpsman tried to take the stretcher off the helicopter, one of them lost his balance and rolled the body out on the runway. And then I had to make sure that we could identify it, get it into a body bag, and process the return home of his remains. That was a very difficult day for me, and I realized I was in for one long year.
Well, I don't know that there was any one more difficult day. I think the dilemma is when you go through this experience and you lose men, you lose really good men, and you've known them like they were your brother, and then you juxtapose that with the attitudes that you found coming back. And you can't, I'm not blaming the American public for their attitudes, but it was probably the hardest day was my return to the United States. That period of time was very rough on me, and you learn to accept that what other people think in a hard way.
I don't think I could pinpoint any single experience in Vietnam. In the artillery, you're usually a good distance away from where the infantry is fighting. The whole time I was over there in the artillery battalion that I was in, nobody was killed, nobody was wounded. We considered ourselves to be pretty lucky in that respect. And, you know, for me, it it was just sort of the whole experience of being there. And, you know, I really hadn't thought a whole lot about it until Phil contacted me and sort of prodded me to write the essay, and actually I've done quite a bit of thinking about it, and then Ed sent me his syllabus, which I was extremely impressed with, and I started reading around in Eliot's book and sort of reviewing a couple of the films, Quiet American, Full Metal Jacket, and so forth. And I don't know, it's something I just sort of repressed, I guess. It's been a very interesting experience, sort of going back over it again. And I'm not sure I could have done it, you know, shortly after I came back. I just wanted to sort of forget it and get on with my life. But I think that, you know, for me, it's the whole package of the experience rather than a single day. And that participation is, you know, I still don't quite know what I feel about it. I'm not sorry I did it, but I'm not sure I accomplished anything for anybody.
Another question?
About the film Full Metal Jacket, I think one of the things that struck me the most that I didn't really understand before was the sentiment that the people of South Vietnam did not want Americans there, and that seemed like a very strong theme, and I'd be really interested to hear your guys' experience with that, and what that feels like to be fighting a war for a country that potentially might not even want you there.
Okay, so the question was specifically about the attitudes of Vietnamese in South Vietnam. And in the film Full Metal Jacket, which we've watched, one of the themes is the antagonism sometimes of South Vietnamese to the American military presence. And what was your experience with South Vietnamese? And did you encounter that hostility?
Well, maybe because I was there first, at an earlier time, I'll go first. But I guess my belief at the time was that the governments, whether it be village or Da Nang or the national government, were pretty weak. Yet there was not, I know what the film did, but there was not anyone who would say to you at that point in time, we don't want you here. What there was a long-standing effort to build the Viet Cong into a organization that would subvert any desire to have freedom. I couldn't put percentages on it, but a good portion of the population had been supportive of the French all the way along, and now they wanted to support the Americans. You had this divide in villages between those who were covertly cooperating with the Viet Cong and those who were asking us very directly to find them a village mayor or a chief that would bring schools and education to their village, which we didn't know how to do, we couldn't do. So there wasn't, the assumption in the movie is not the reality. Between 65 and 67, I think anytime a country goes into, one country goes into another and begins to create the kind of destruction, you know, just Agent Orange, which, I mean, I saw a lot of Agent Orange too. I probably have something myself that I don't know. But that was devastating. I mean, what was done to some of these villages in the heat of the fight was horrendous. There was less and less chance each week, each month, that the United States could in any way be successful. There was no strategy to come in and help the people. People respond to leadership. There was no leadership. And so, I don't know, I guess it's a partial answer.
Sure.
No, I've never been able to watch any of the movies.
Yeah,
What about this question of the South Vietnamese and your interactions with them?
I think I would second what Lee said. My experience with the Vietnamese troops we dealt with in the Mekong Delta was that they were poorly organized, poorly led. The regime in Saigon was very corrupt. They relied on what was called the white mice, the Quan Chan, which was the military police arm to keep the populace in line. And as Lee said, it was just an exercise in futility. You wanted to do the best you could, and even though you did the best you could, it didn't accomplish anything.
I can give you a little bit different perspective on it. When you're dealing with the Vietnamese, I mean, for the most part, they were happy to take your money. The presence of so many American military was a financial boon for a lot of people who were just dirt poor, who had been forced off of, you know, farming and other things. On the other hand, these same people who would help you, who emptied the latrines on the base camps, who helped with other kinds of menial tasks during the day, with a very friendly smile, would shoot at you at night.
Yep.
And you just didn't know what their sympathies were. And there were some Vietnamese who were probably happy to have us there. I mean, the Viet Cong and you know, and those who were fighting for a socialist nationalist state certainly didn't want us there. But I can't remember any Vietnamese being unfriendly to my face.
Connor, I think you had a question.
Yeah, well, it's going back to what we were talking about earlier about how it sounds like you all had a sense relatively early on that not much was getting done on the ground, but yet you talked about earlier how, like Stars and Stripes, you would be hearing about all the positives that were happening, and I was just wondering if if that was a widely held view, the view that you had to think that nothing that you were doing was really actually leading to anything, and B, how did you actually reconcile the differences between what you were hearing was happening and what you were actually seeing on the ground?
I stopped reading Stars and Stripes.
Just to repeat the question. The question in two parts was, let's see, how can I summarize this? It was that sort of the gap between sort of the official representations of the war in publications like Stars and Stripes and what soldiers were actually seeing on the ground, and you know what was their response to that. And then, I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question?
It was like a widely held, I guess, discussed view among people, or if it was more something that you actually, you noticed but didn't talk about.
Okay. And so then this gap between sort of the official line and the actual experience, was this something you just sort of took in stride, or was this something that people complained about?
I'm not sure I know how to answer that question.
Well, I think perhaps, Bud, you were sort of talking about some of these problems before, weren't you? About
Yeah, I mean, whether it was widely shared or not, I honestly don't know. I can say that the people that worked for me when I was over there, I dealt mostly with warrant officers and NCOs I don't think they thought much about the war and anything beyond what they were there to do. They were just there to do their job. Everybody was on a one-year tour, and everyone rotated out after a year. Some of the troops in the barracks spent most of their time counting the days till they left, which shows a certain, I think, level of sort of dissatisfaction with what they were doing, or I'm not sure how aware they were of the gap between the more optimistic views of the war and, you know, what they were seeing on the ground. The average, you know, sort of artillery person probably didn't have a clear sense of what was, you know, going on in other units or in the country as a whole, except maybe if they read Stars and Stripes, which gave you a pretty slanted view of things. I don't think I can answer the question either, actually.
Well, I think.
I'll give it, well, go ahead.
Go ahead, you go ahead.
I'll give it a try. I think the way I think about it is that most of us who, you know, would fall into the trap of reading avidly Stars and Stripes and listening to what was being said wanted to believe that there was no difference between what was going on. But as you spent time over there, and as it got to be closer to 13 or 15 months, and you could see more and more, you realized that it wasn't so much that the official line was different than what we were experiencing. In my view, it was that the United States did not realize, did not know, the higher leaders, you know, above those of us on the ground, did not even realize the weaknesses, the strengths, the opportunities that were there in Vietnam. We did not have a good grasp of what the country was all about. And I can say that when I left in 1967, I don't think, whether it's political leaders or military leaders, that we really had a grasp of what we were dealing with. And obviously we learned between then and 1975, but many of us, officers, would communicate these things, and they went up the chain and so forth. But I don't think it's nice to look back in history and see these sharp differences, but people did not perceive or understand those differences at the time, at least in my humble opinion.
Yeah, we got to realize that things weren't going the way they should be going because of certain things that were done by what I'll call the professional military, the field grade officers in the ranks of major up through general, because their ability to get promoted and to move up the ladder was directly tied to their ability to have a war going on. And they would do things that we knew were totally wrong, but they ordered us to do them anyway. And Bud alluded to it, one aspect of it, in his essay, where he talks about driving from one base up to Bearcat.
Yeah, to Swanlock.
Swanlock. A couple of my friends were in the order of battle section, and their responsibility once a month was to update the road report. And the road report had different categories of road. If it was green, it was safe to drive on the road alone. If it was yellow, you should proceed with caution. If it was red, you had to move an armed convoy. So they did the road report, and most of the roads were red. I mean, we weren't dummies. We weren't going to go out on the road except in an armed group. The colonel who was running our intelligence section sent it back to them and told them they had to redo it because it looked worse than the previous month's road report. So they did. One of my responsibilities at 7 o'clock every morning was to meet with the Vietnamese adjutant for the 4th Corps and get the casualty figures for the almighty body count of killed, wounded, and suspects detained, and get on the scrambler phone and call those to SICV headquarters up, the Central Intelligence headquarters up in Saigon. Well, that worked for a while, and then the Army came down with a directive that said we had to have 10 or 12 different categories of killed by ground forces, killed by air, estimated killed by artillery, estimated killed by air. And the Vietnamese would only give me the same 3 figures, which I would relay to Saigon. And that went on for 4 or 5 days when all of a sudden the colonel called me into his office and screaming at me, saying, "What's the matter with you? You're making me look bad. You're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. You're not filling out these figures properly." I said, "Well, Colonel, I can only give you what the Vietnamese give me." He said to me, "It sounds like you got a personal problem, Captain." Well, I did. I had a personal problem, and I had a personal solution to it. I went back and I faked the figures. So for 6 or 8 months, a quarter of the casualty figures that Lyndon Johnson was reporting to the country were a figment of my overly active imagination.
You know, one thing I've learned since Vietnam is Vietnam was the first war where the leaders, the commanding leaders, were not relieved of duty if they were not successful, you know, under someone's reasonable judgment. In World War II, if a captain didn't succeed, he was relieved of command. And that was true of all wars in the United States up until Vietnam. And so what they've said about, there were all sorts of, I was promoted to rank of captain in 15 months. There were people that took 7 years to become captain because they came in after, or actually 12 years, they came in after the Korean War. And so their whole desire was to go out and get combat experience so they could be promoted and so that they could advance their career, because what you had in the military, at least at the officer level, you had all these people who had gone from 2nd lieutenant to 1st lieutenant to captain, that's the Marine Corps, and they were all at the captain level. Who was going to make major? These are career officers who, if they don't make major, they're going to have to go do something else. But the problem was that so they all wanted to get into combat, and a lot of them did not have the competency. They never had any experience at it, so they were no better than the 2nd lieutenant who came over in his first month, and they might have had 14, 15 years in the service. And I do think that is an impact on the military that started in Vietnam, and is if I have any judgment about it, I may not, it's worse in Afghanistan and Iraq today, where people are doing this because they want to further their careers.
I think we have time for one more question. Corey.
I know we talked about the hardships you guys faced coming home, but I just wanted to hear about how happy and relieved you were to come home and see friends and families. I know Mr. Laughlin, he talked about how your wife, who you just married, had to go back and live with her parents, and she wasn't very happy about that. So,
what's the question?
The question is about coming home and feelings of relief or happiness that you may have had. And Corey referred specifically to what you described in your essay about your wife and how she wasn't very happy, because while you were in Vietnam, she had to go live with her parents.
Oh, that was a tremendously dislocating experience, as I mentioned in my essay. It was very tough on my wife and me, and I remember leaving her with her parents in Michigan and getting her father to drive me to the airport with her because I knew she wasn't going to make it on her own. And when I said goodbye, she started to cry, and I turned around and I walked up the gangplank without looking back, because I knew if I looked back, I wasn't going to go. And I was fortunate to survive without a scratch at the time, I thought. And we were greatly relieved when we left the country. When we got on that plane, which was packed with soldiers, and we flew out of Saigon Airport, it was dead quiet until the captain came on the speakerphone and said, "We just cleared the coast of Vietnam." Well, the place exploded. And I was ready, I just wanted to get back and get my civilian life going again. And my wife and I got back together and made a life with having 3 sons, and she had a career and I had a career, and we were both successful at it. And we've been married for 46 years, which is kind of a minor miracle these days, I guess.
Lee?
Well, I think I had the same experience, except tracer bullets were coming up at our DC-7 or whatever it was as we flew out of Saigon Airport. So it's the last 2 days of the Tet Offensive, and there had been sapper attacks in Saigon, and I wasn't sure we were going to get out of there. So you know, I don't know that I had feelings of elation when I came back. Having seen what I saw, I think it just took, I just wanted to be quiet and left alone for a long time. But over the years, we all worked through those things, and, you know, thankful I'm alive.
I had a similar experience with Jim. My wife at the time was stayed with her parents for the year that I was in Vietnam. But also my daughter was born in June of '67, and I left for Vietnam in September of '67. And so I missed, you know, basically the entire, you know, first year of her life. And so I was very happy to get back and to, you know, make the acquaintance of my daughter. Although there was one, my first night back, it was bizarre. It's an interesting story. My wife's parents were staying had a cottage at Hampton Beach, and my first night back, they gave us the cottage for the night, and it was very nice of them to do that. But unbeknownst to me, we went to sleep fairly early, I guess 9, 10 o'clock at night or something like that. But at midnight, they had a fireworks display. And just, you know, on impulse, I rolled out of bed onto the floor, started reaching for my gear. And it was, but that was the last incident like that. I mean, I didn't have a series of those, but you know, it was like bringing the war home with me in a sense. Although it was funny, I laughed at the time. Once I realized I wasn't being shot at.
All right. Well, I think we're out of time, so we're going to have to call it quits there.
I would just like to thank Ed and Phil for organizing this and for giving us the opportunity to explore a chapter in our lives that we needed to be pushed a little bit, I think, to explore it. So thank you both.
I would second that, and also I want to thank the students who have been so attentive and participating and participatory tonight. I hope that we've been able to give you some insights that you haven't previously had, and I think it's been valuable for us to get some of this stuff off our chests, too.
Yeah, I do too want to thank the students and also Phil. This is something I should have done a long time ago, and it's I appreciate your questions very much, and if any of you have questions afterwards, I'd be happy to talk to you.
Yes.
Likewise.
Thank you.
Thank you
very
again.
much.